There's actually three separate battles. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. And the one that we're going to talk about is involving the IJN Yamato. That would be the largest battleship ever constructed. It's either 11 or 13 feet longer than its sister ship, the IJM Musashi, named after the greatest Japanese swordsman of all time, Miyamoto Musashi. Alright, so the Musashi was sunk. The Yamato, on the other hand, was part of a 23-ship force going up against a force of 6 escort class carriers with a top speed of 17 to 18 knots, whereas an Essex class carrier was almost twice its length. And that's what we started off the war with. The USS Enterprise and the first Hornet and the first Yorktown. All three Essex class carriers. Essex class carriers had a complement of 83 to 91 airplanes. They could also go 33 knots, so they were pretty quick. Not quite twice the speed of an escort carrier, but pretty fast. An escort carrier carried on average 18 to 23 aircraft, 18 to 23 plus one. The plus one was usually an aircraft that was kept as parts but assembled. The reason for that is because you could pull out an entire assembly out of that aircraft that is already set up and tuned, and you can bolt it right onto something else. So, the IJN Yamato. This thing was so big, largest battleship ever built. Had 18-inch guns on it. And of course, we got to go real big, don't we? Well, the Yamato was so heavy, it weighed more than every single ship in Taffy 3. That was the American forces. Now, they were caught with their pants down. They were not expecting the Japanese fleet. But another thing is, they also weren't expecting the fog banks or the rain. The rain squalls and the fog banks worked to the Japanese advantage, and basically, well, it wasn't sneaking up on the Americans. They basically just ran into the Americans. But they were also expecting Halsey's Third Fleet. Oddly enough, both the Japanese and the Americans mistook each other for Halsey's Third Fleet. Now, it was kind of strange because the Samuel B. Roberts weighed as much as one turret on the Yamato. Almost as much as one turret. So, when you consider that there was 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, as well as 6 escort carriers on the American side, and all of them together did not weigh as much as the Yamato. And then you consider the fact that there were at least 30 kamikaze aircraft. And at that point, they also had some aircraft that came in, assisted with getting those kamikazes to where they wanted them. The problem is that everything was half scale. The ships were all half scale, basically, to the Japanese. That's what it looked like. It looked like it was a full-scale fleet, because they mistook the Bogue class escort carriers for Essex class light carriers. Although the Essex class would have been considered medium carriers at the time, but silhouetted with visibility issues, yeah, it was easy to tell that scale was definitely going to be an issue. So basically, the Japanese had 4 large or heavy battleships. Each one of them weighing a lot. When you look at Samuel B. Roberts, this thing was confused as a light cruiser. Since they confused aircraft carriers that only held about 18 to 24 aircraft and could carry up to 38, but that was only for resupply. Like say you were going to Midway, you needed to resupply the aircraft on Midway, you would load up a Bogue class aircraft carrier to the max, and then they would actually have to crane lift the first aircraft off the ship. They couldn't actually launch aircraft from it. Now, we talk about everything the Americans lost during the battle. We consider that they had only half the amount of ships that the Japanese had, and that just one single Japanese ship weighed more than the entire American task force. And then we consider that most of that task force was actually loaded up for resupply. They're supposed to support the landing, and as a result of supporting the landing, they had several of them that were set up for launching aircraft. They had one of them that was basically they had 2 aircraft carriers out of those that were set up for launch. 3 of them were set up so that they could, well, they would have to basically dump aircraft over the side in order to launch anything. They'd have to launch the first 3 rows of aircraft. Basically, by launch, what I mean is that they're not going to build up enough speed to actually get up in the air. They're going into the water no matter what. So basically, you're just pushing it over the side or pushing it over the front. Another thing is that affected the decision making on what shells were fired. When you're mistaking destroyers for cruisers and you're mistaking destroyer escorts as light cruisers, yeah, you got your scale messed up. That did help out as far as being able to tell the distance on your enemy ships, being as there should have been at least one light cruiser with them, as well as well, you would expect to have at least an older class battleship along with ships like that. Something similar to the Texas class, or the Texas from World War One. I mean, you're not talking about a massive battleship, but it's an actual battleship. They're also slow battleships, and that's one of the things about the Essex class carrier. Yes, they held 90 aircraft, and that was great. They were also twice the length of the Bogue class escort carriers. They held almost 4 times as many aircraft, and that depends on how you look at it. I mean, if you're talking about loading up the Essex class with 18 aircraft, which is actually optimal for launch, then just a single Essex class aircraft carrier has more than 4 times the complement of aircraft. What's 18 times 4? Oh, 72, I believe. 72 out of 90. So that would mean that an Essex-class carrier carries literally the equivalent of aircraft of 5 of the Bogue-class aircraft carriers. There's also the fact that some of those Bogue-class, since they had overloaded on them, they weren't useful as aircraft carriers. They were basically just aircraft transporters. They were able to push a few aircraft off of some of them and get them going. They were loaded up with anti-submarine depth charges, which basically just bounced off the enemy ships. Bounced off the Yamato. They tried to hit the superstructure, and that was highly effective. That was probably the part of the battle that really made the most sense. You hit the bridge of the ship, you keep the command in a state of disarray and shock. If they're in a state of disarray and shock, state of fear, well, they may try to hold their composure and remain steadfast, but their decision making ain't going to be that great. It also prevents you from being able to really size up your opponent. Then there's the fact that the Samuel B. Roberts and the USS Johnston both dropped their fish in the water. By fish, what I mean is torpedoes. And that kept the larger battleships in a state of movement. When we talk about the amount of aircraft that were expended during the battle by the Americans, most of them knew that they were going in the water. That's just how it was going to be. But if they could keep the Japanese ships moving and maneuvering, then they could prevent the Japanese ships from getting a good bead on them. And that was essential. Now, the Japanese, they used colored rounds. When the round would hit the water, it would put off a colored dye, and each ship had its own different colored dye. That way the ships could sight it in based on whatever their rounds are hitting instead of confusing one white splash for another. Now, as far as the scaling issue goes, as far as the size of the ships, the Japanese thought that the enemy ships were bigger than they were, so they got the distance on them wrong. And every ship that was a part of Laffey 3, every single one of them got hit. They lost one of the escort carriers entirely. I believe it was the Gambier Bay. But one of the things that is really not looked into in the battle is the kamikaze pilots. 30 of them. And oftentimes when people tell the story of the Johnston, they focus on the Johnston, the Gambier Bay, and the Samuel B. Roberts, because those were the 3 ships that sank on the American side. There actually ended up being 4 of them sank overall. Now, when we consider that just one ship of the Japanese weighed more than every single American ship combined, and then we consider the Japanese had 23 ships, most of them being battleships and cruisers, whether it be light cruisers, heavy cruisers, light battleships, or heavy battleships. Now, one of the other things that really messed with it is that the Americans tended to send in 2 different types of fleets. You've got the fast, strike hard, strike fast type of fleet, the Essex carriers, a lot of the newer battleships, The Iowa class being capable of 33 knots, the Essex class carriers being capable of 27 to 33 knots, they would travel together. When you're talking about the fact that a lot of the aircraft carriers, there's no way that they were going to outrun something like the Yamato. The Yamato was capable of going 27 to 33 knots. And there's some of their service numbers claiming that they could go up to 38 knots, which is phenomenal, but not entirely impossible, especially given the number and type of boilers that they had and the type of engines that were in there, as well as the number of screws. Screws is the name of the propeller on a battleship or an aircraft carrier or something that size or that type. The slower speed of a lot of the ships in Taffy 3 also helped to mess with the scale, because it kind of looks like it's moving the scale from a distance for a faster ship as well. But those kamikaze pilots didn't really do much damage. We don't hear about the kamikaze pilots hitting any of them, as far as I'm aware. I know that during the battle, there were several carriers that were hit by kamikaze pilots, but this is over. It ended up being a 3-day battle that started off with aircraft against the Musashi, basically. American aircraft versus the Japanese Musashi. There was also the Surigao Strait. That was one of the most important parts of the battle as well. That's when older American battleships squared off against older Japanese battleships and newer Japanese battleships in the last line battle ever to be fought by two navies against one another. And they pasted the Japanese because, if you really think about it, the Americans already had all of their ships trained for one portion of the island, where any ship that comes over around the island, it's only going to be able to bring them about one at a time. So as they're coming in range, they're getting blasted. Now the third part of the battle is the battle off Samar Island, the Taffy 3. I don't know if one of the escort carriers was hit during the Battle of the Samar Island, or if it was during the engagement with the Musashi, but I do remember reading about one of them, and I believe there was two of them that had gone in at the time. One of them had almost, they thought it was going to miss the ship, and then it just kind of flipped over and landed on their deck. But I'm going to have to relook that up because I can't remember. But much of the point is that the Americans stood literally no chance of winning that battle. They won the battle. Why did they win the battle? Because they actually fought. And they were able to throw enough at their enemy that they were able to keep their enemy confused as to what was going on and affect the scaling of the rounds they were firing. Had they known that they were going up against light-hulled craft, they probably would have used high explosive rounds, which are a lot more effective against something like a light carrier. When you're talking about an Essex carrier, or an Essex carrier upgraded, which would be with torpedo blisters and things of that nature, you're talking about a whole different monster. Also, one of the reasons that the American carriers were able to get away is because of rain squall. A lot of the aircraft that took off from the American carriers couldn't actually land back on the American carriers. They were basically only in case of emergencies. And that's where the +1 comes from. When they put the aircraft on there, you could have up to 23 +1 aircraft. That +1 is usually a scout plane, and it's usually an offset from one of your squadrons. The reason for that is because you're going to take one of your squadron planes and you're going to set it aside. That squadron plane is, let's say you've got an F-4U Corsair on board your ship, and your F-4U Corsair is going to have problems landing on that aircraft carrier. It can still do it, it's just going to have problems. Alright, there we go. Now, what effect did the Japanese kamikaze pilots really have in the battle? Like I said, there was over 30 kamikaze planes that were involved in it, and there was even a few fighter escorts that went along with them. When you consider that the aircraft complement of a single Essex carrier accounts for, well, 5 of those escort carriers, you consider that every escort carrier was hit, but you also consider that torpedoes that were launched by the destroyers, well, 5 destroyers in a row, all decided that it wasn't worth it to get close enough to actually fire the long lance torpedoes. The 21-inch long lance torpedoes. Very, very nice. Longest range torpedoes of the war. So what's the effect of the kamikaze pilots? Just to slow everything down? Just to go strafing? Well, pretty much. A big battleship is a lot easier target to hit than something like the Johnston. We're talking about something that's, well, it's not very wide. When we're talking about American aircraft carriers, we're talking about like 180 to 230 feet wide. And we're talking about the Johnston, we're talking about something that's 80 feet wide, if that. Not 80 feet. I'm sorry about that. It's not 80 feet wide. I did know the numbers of it just a few minutes ago. I just wasn't able to remember all of it. When you're talking about something that's a lot more maneuverable, something that's a lot smaller than you're expecting to hit, it's not going the speed that you've been practicing and training for. You're probably not going to hit what you're aiming for. One thing that they said American ships have to fear is biplanes. That's right. In the modern world, American ships have to be afraid of a biplane. But who's going to build a military biplane this day and age? Nobody. Nobody's going to do that. Why are biplanes such a wonderful gift in the modern era versus these things? Because people are always trying to make everything bigger and faster. So the stuff we put on our ships is to go after stuff that's bigger and faster. We got to see with the ferry swordfish and the British attack on the fleet at Toronto. That was absolutely amazing. The Japanese even went to check out the aftermath to help plan their attack on Pearl Harbor. But the ferry swordfish was a slow aircraft. Very difficult to hit because, well, By World War II, everything was a lot faster than in World War I. They expected everything to be faster than in World War I. So, of course, they made everything and trained everything for faster aircraft. The swordfish was tough to hit because it wasn't flying fast enough for the auto tracking on those aircraft or on those anti-aircraft guns to actually follow them. We had kind of the same issue at the Samar Islands. The Japanese were set up and equipped for going after cruisers and battleships. They thought that they'd found Halsey's Third Fleet. And of course, the Samuel B. Roberts, they were assuming that it was Halsey's Third Fleet showing back up. So the battle started off as a chance meeting that was confusing. The Japanese implemented what was supposed to be a surprise flanking maneuver, but the other half of their force had already turned back. Other than that, their surprise attack was launched and implemented and executed perfectly, except for the fact that it was unexpected. The Japanese did not expect the force that they ran into to be exactly in that spot. When they emerged from the fog, they weren't expecting a whole bunch of ships to be popping up a bunch of smoke and firing at them and hitting them in the superstructure. Many of them aiming specifically for the pagoda mast. Now, when we found a few of the ships that were sunk, we gave the Samuel B. Roberts and the Johnston, as well as, I want to say not the Hermes, it might be the Hermes. We gave them credit for being extremely accurate. And then when we found the Japanese ships that they hit, we found out that they were even 30% more accurate than we had originally given them credit for. That is very significant. Because the American ships, they had one 5-inch gun per turret and 3 or 4 5-inch turrets per destroyer or destroyer escort. Whereas the Musashi, the weight of fire of one projectile was heavier than if all of Taffy 3 had fired all of their projectiles at once. The weight of fire of the Yamato, just one broadside, that was a lot. Now, when we talk about all of the lead that's being thrown up in the air, because all of a sudden we have aircraft carriers being confused for something they're not, trying to escape into a squall. They're dropping the wrong ordnance. We've got the Johnston and the Roberts both start throwing out Starshot. This is for illumination at night. So basically they're starting a whole bunch of wooden decks on fire. Japanese decks were made of wood, same as the American decks. It's a slip-resistant surface, but also that kind of scares and intimidates people. Also, since those create fire, and then you've also got the smoke rounds, because, these guys were running out of ammunition quick. They were throwing smoke rounds, and those smoke rounds, of course, make it look like your ship is in worse shape than it actually is. The Japanese were freaked out. The amount of shipping that the Taffy 3 was able to sink was greater than the combined weight of every single ship in Taffy 3. So, all in all, it's an American victory. There's also the fact that the Japanese withdrew. A lot of the decisions for the Japanese were based on coming out of a cloud bank and getting smacked in the face. You're getting smacked in the face with something from a distance. How many of y'all have walked outside of your house and somebody has got a spray hose and they spray you right in the face, right? You can't really tell who it is that sprayed you. You know it's one of your little brothers, but what do you know that one of them's 17 and one of them's 7? You just know that it's one of your little brothers and you get sprayed in the face. Well, it doesn't really do any damage to you. And you could be armed with an AK-47. The problem is you just got sprayed in the face, and he's just going to keep spraying you in the face. It's going to be difficult for you to get a shot on him. And that's really the only part that screwed the Johnston is that when they went in solo the first time. Made sure that they launched something, anything to get the Japanese moving. But although it was what ultimately sealed their fate, turning back around isn't what sealed their fate. They weren't going to be able to outrun those Japanese ships. Not after the first run. However, the first run is what initiated the contact and initiated the torpedoes in the water that got the Japanese ships to start zigzagging. Several of them collided with one another. They all slowed down. The moment you start turning when you're in the water, you start slowing down. There's just too much sideways resistance. Then, throughout the entire battle, you've got Japanese kamikazes coming in and dive bombing at you. While you're throwing a bunch of lead up in the air, and you're also trying to send off and receive ships. You've got a ship that's basically, well, you've got 3 of your escort carriers that are not set up to launch anything. You've got 2 of them that are set up to launch. Basically, their job is to protect the landings and also protect the task force. Then you've got 1 ship that's basically a reserve ship. You are not really able to land anything on it. The deck is full. You have to strap the aircraft down to the deck. But you can also, it's far enough back that you can actually still launch them off the deck. The problem is once you've launched them, you can't actually receive them on your same aircraft carrier. It has to go to one of the other 2 aircraft carriers that are set up for catching airplanes. That has a lot to do with deck space and the ability to maneuver airplanes during battle. Basically, the American maneuvering was to get away from shell fire. They didn't really focus that heavy on trying to stay away from the kamikazes. And in a lot of the stories that I've been listening to about it, I've noticed that most of the stories leave the kamikazes out. Once in a while, you'll have a commentary from like the 1980s or early 90s where you've got somebody that was involved in the battle that talks about the Japanese plane that came over real close to one of their aircraft carriers and went into the water. You also get to hear about how one of the destroyers got strafed, but other than that, it doesn't really bring up any of the Japanese. It definitely doesn't bring up the fact that these were kamikaze pilots, except for, the one guy talking about the airplane going right over the deck. They don't know if it was a kamikaze or not. Obviously, it was aiming for their ship. It did have a 500-pound bomb hanging underneath. But this is the way that we took back over the Philippines and a lot of the area there. We also ended up withdrawing a lot of the aircraft carriers for the landing and leaving just a small number of Marines to fend for themselves, and they did a really good job. They did a great job, matter of fact, defending the area and also coordinating with locals. There was a Australian radio operator, and he was a civilian, not military, and he was very important and very successful in assisting the Marines getting information and getting supply runs and things of that nature, coordinating with the locals because he knew the language. But a lot of people don't understand the importance of that battle. I mean, that battle right there made it so that the Japanese fleet had to tiptoe back home. When we talk about all of the aircraft that the Japanese lost in the battle, and then we talk about all of the aircraft that the Americans lost in the battle, the Americans lost a lot more in the battle. Also, though, one of the American tactics, and you're going to laugh at this, the Americans, a lot of their airplanes didn't have any guns in them, or didn't have any ammunition in them if they did have guns. They were supposed to be going to combat units. Basically, a lot of the aircraft that were there were supposed to be replacements for aircraft that were damaged. So we had a bunch of pilots that got into those airplanes, didn't have any ordnance on them, weren't going to do a lick of damage, but they were able to keep the battleships focused on them, thinking that they were making torpedo runs when there's no torpedoes underneath and no bombs. Basically, it's like stopping somebody from going into a school and shooting a bunch of people by having a pellet gun with no ammo in it. I mean, basically, you're just false deterrent. As long as they fall for it, you've done a great job. But it all comes down to scale. And if it hadn't been for the slower speed and lower speed and the silhouetting, the chemical smoke generators, as well as the fuel dump directly into the exhaust pipes, as well as the rain squalls and the fog bank, I mean, it basically just made for a big mess. And then you've got all the smoke from the cordite, all the powder charges. I mean, it wasn't going to be easy to be able to tell what it was that was shooting at you from that distance. The Americans, they got pretty lucky in the fact that they knew exactly what they were going up against. They had a couple of scout airplanes that flew over the top right at the very start of the battle and announced that it was the largest battleship they'd ever seen. All right, so Christian's out there. He does have a blanket. I'm going to make sure that I video him just because he's out there. At least he's got a blanket. All right. So we're getting back to the Battle of Samar Island. I pronounced that wrong because I have no teeth, and I do apologize. I do know how to pronounce it right. I just don't have any teeth. Getting back to the kamikaze impact, they really didn't have any impact on the battle. Obviously. A lot of the ships, they could have swerved, but they were more interested in getting away from the Yamato than they were getting away from the aircraft, and obviously they didn't have a whole lot to worry about from the aircraft. And I believe that there was one kamikaze aircraft that slammed into one of the 6 escort carriers, but I'm not for certain about that, so don't quote me. One of the things about the firepower of those smaller ships, they could reload a lot faster. And that should have been the first clue for the Yamato and her crew, is that these little ships were firing a lot faster. The Johnston was firing a lot faster. We're talking about, they expended over 200 rounds apparently in 5 minutes. That's amazing. They expended on some of the other ships 600 rounds in an hour. Now, when you consider the Roberts supposedly fired 200 of them in like 5 minutes. That's a lot. Firing for the superstructures is a very smart idea. One of the best things about the Japanese being so confused and the American pilots coming in from every direction, strafing from the top, coming in for bomber runs, coming in for dive bomb runs, coming in for fake torpedo runs, the Japanese ended up shooting down some of their own kamikaze pilots. All right, I'm done talking though, because I'm tired. I want to get some sleep. Um, I guess I'm going to have to forget about my stuff up in the mountains for another day. I still don't have any help. People don't understand. They just procrastinate. And the longer they procrastinate, the more risk it puts me at, the more risk it puts my stuff at. And I keep hoping people will listen beyond just entertainment. When it's just entertainment, though, no big thing. They might get back to you in a month or two. That's nuts. All right. Good to be with you. Thanks for coming to visit. Stay out of trouble or don't get caught. Remember, you are your brother's keeper and no victim left behind. You're also your sister's keeper, too. Just because this is a war story doesn't mean that there weren't women involved, at least some step of it. And today we do have women in the modern military. So let's not leave them out. Let's not pretend that they can't be victims. And also, never underestimate the power of rich people in stupid numbers. People with power don't like to give it up, and they don't care how many lives are thrown away uselessly to get them what they want. The IJN Yamato, the IJN Musashi, and all of those kamikaze pilots were all wasted lives. Every one of them. I also wanted to point out that the very first shots of World War II between Japan and America were fired by the United States into a midget submarine. Also, the first air-to-air kill, since America had not officially declared war against Japan, but Japan had declared war against the United States, the very first air-to-air, what do they call that? The first American kill against a Japanese airplane from another aircraft was made by a Schwartz. So the first air-to-air kill by an American during the war was by a Schwartz. And the first shot of the war was actually fired by Americans. And Taffy 3, well, that should be known as an overwhelming Japanese victory, and it's not. Don't throw away people's lives. You can't get them back. And the Japanese learned that quick. You know who else learned that lesson in World War II? The Germans.